Education and Labor will come to order for the purposes of conducting a hearing on H.R. 5522, the Combustible Dust Explosion and Fire Prevention Act of 2008. We're going to go ahead and start the hearing at this point. It appears that we will have a number of procedural and parliamentary votes and motions on the floor, so we're going to try to get through this in the best way we can this morning, and make sure that we have time for all of our witnesses. And our first two witnesses will be first the Honorable John Barrow, who represents Georgia's 12th Congressional District and includes the Imperial Sugar Refinery. John and I are co-sponsors of H.R. 5522, the subject of this hearing this morning. We welcome you to the committee, and we welcome and thank you for the cooperation with the committee staff and the help that your district office gave us as we sent staff down to the site of this accident. When Mr. Kingston comes in, our colleague Jack Kingston is a congressman, represents Georgia's 1st Congressional District, which lies adjacent, as I understand it, to this area where the Imperial Sugar refinery is. He will also join us at the witness table. If he's delayed, we'll call the panel and we'll take Congressman Kingston when he arrives. If I might, just with some opening remarks, say that just over a month ago, an explosion ripped through the Imperial Sugar plant outside of Savannah, Georgia, killing 12 workers and critically injuring 11 others. The probable cause of this explosion was combustible sugar dust. The loss of lives in workplace incidents is always a tragedy, but what's particularly troubling about the Imperial Sugar explosion is that not only was it preventable, but the U.S. Occupational Safety and Health Administration had been specifically warned about the dust hazards and provided a guidance on how to address them. The U.S. Chemical Safety Board warned OSHA over a year ago that existing standards were inadequate to guard against the risk of industrial dust like sugar building up in dangerous levels and exploding. As we will hear today, in 2006, the Chemical Safety Board issued a comprehensive study that identified hundreds of combustible dust incidents that had killed over 100 workers during the previous 25 years. The Chemical Safety Board report found that no comprehensive federal rules exist for to control the risk of dust explosions in general industry, and recommended that OSHA issue such rules. Tragically, well more than a year after the Chemical Safety Board's report was issued, OSHA has taken no action to issue combustible dust rules. In today's hearing, we will discuss legislation H.R. 5522 to require OSHA to issue a standard to protect workers against combustible dust explosions. The new standard would be based on a well-recognized, highly effective voluntary standards issued by the National Fire Protection Association. Sadly, OSHA's failure to act on combustible dust is not the first time the agency's inaction may have cost workers their lives. For example, in December 19th, in 2007, 4 workers died in a massive explosion at the T2 Chemicals plant in Jacksonville, Florida, that the likely cause was runaway chemical reaction. The Chemical Safety Board had warned OSHA about this chemical reaction hazard in 2002 report that identified 108 fatalities in the previous 20 years resulting from explosions caused by chemical reactions. The Chemical Safety Board report made recommendations for addressing reactive hazards, but as with the dust hazard, OSHA chose not to follow up on the recommendations. Instead, OSHA chose to rely on the compliance assistance and voluntary programs such as industry alliances, web pages, fact sheets, speeches, and booths at industry conferences. The Chemical Safety Board judged these voluntary activities to be unacceptable. The bottom line is that under the Bush administration, OSHA has utterly failed to fulfill its congressional mandate. The agency is leaving the Congress with no choice but to step in. Just look at the record of the last 12 months. On March 22nd, 2007, this committee held a hearing on a British Petroleum Texas City refinery explosion that killed 15 workers. In the decade before our hearing, OSHA had not conducted a single comprehensive inspection of any refinery in the United States. 2 days before the hearing, OSHA announced it would step up inspections in refineries nationwide. On April 24, 2007, the Subcommittee on Workforce Protections held a hearing on OSHA's failure to address the death and illnesses of workers in the food flavoring industry, deaths caused by the horrific, irreversible lung disease now called popcorn lung. Hours after the hearing, OSHA announced a so-called National Emphasis Program targeting food and flavoring manufacturers. On September 26, 2007, the House approved a bill forcing OSHA to develop rules to protect food flavoring workers. Just hours before that vote, OSHA announced it was going to start the rulemaking process. The day after the Imperial Sugar explosion, Congresswoman Lynn Woolsey and I sent a letter to Secretary Chow requesting the standards on combustible dust. On the morning of March 3rd, after receiving no response from Secretary Chow, Congressman Barrow and I introduced the H.R. 5522. Coincidentally, the same morning as we made the announcement, Assistant Secretary Falk was in Savannah conducting a series of press interviews, and he announced that OSHA would conduct more combustible dust inspections and send letters to companies at risk. But there is no reason for OSHA to wait to get to work on issuing new rules that would prevent this kind of disaster in the future. The National Fire Protection Association and others have known for a long time what causes these explosions, and the National Fire Protection Association's voluntary standards are feasible and affordable. Unfortunately, we see this tragic pattern of workplace injury or death followed by OSHA inaction everywhere we look. We see it in the agency's failure to inspect refineries, in its failure to issue new workplace safety rules, in its failure to address ergonomic hazards, in its failure to effectively address some potential hazards of pandemic flu, and its failure to meet even its own deadlines on standards for workers' personal protection equipment and other life-threatening hazards. It is this highly questionable injury and illness statistics and its promotion of voluntary programs over strong law enforcement that troubles us. Let me be clear, the Congress will continue to step in until OSHA starts to consistently and aggressively fulfilling its responsibility of protecting the lives of American workers. I'd like to thank all of our witnesses in advance for joining us today, and the committee appreciates your testimony. Congressman Barrow, welcome to the committee, and we look forward to your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for calling this hearing on H.R. 5522, the Combustible Dust Explosion and Fire Prevention Act of 2008. Just over a month ago, on February 7th, the Imperial Sugar refinery in Port Wentworth, just outside my home of Savannah, was destroyed by a massive explosion. The explosion killed 12 people, maimed dozens more, and shut down the economic engine that drove an entire community. I have visited with the families of the dead and the dying. I've attended the meetings. I've attended the memorial services. And the question I hear over and over again is why? Why did this happen? And what can we do to prevent this from happening again? Turns out that the cause is something that most folks don't even know about at all, don't know is the least bit dangerous at all, and that's too much sugar dust all over the place. Also turns out there are lots and lots of other industrial dust that can cause massive explosions like this and have been causing massive explosions like this for as long as manufacturing plants have been generating dust on an industrial scale. What we've learned in my community since this disaster hit us is that the experts in the field have known about this problem for decades. There have been voluntary standards that effectively deal with this problem, but not enough people know about the problem, much less the solutions, and even those who know about the solutions aren't required to adopt them. We've also learned that the only standards that are mandatory really aren't designed with this problem in mind, and they aren't working. And so we have good standards that are not mandatory and inadequate standards that are mandatory. So here we are again, and once again the cry goes up to fix this problem that's been around for so long, only this time we're not going to forget about what happened. We're not going to stop until we do what we can to cut down this risk as much as possible. Now, up until now, the argument's been between those who say we shouldn't go too fast in developing a national standard and those who argue that we're going too slow. There are those who argue that the costs of a comprehensive solution outweigh the benefits. We've even had some people argue that we should go slow in adopting a national standard because we run the risk of encouraging employers to take our jobs to some other country where they don't care as much about worker safety as we do. I disagree. I say if we can prevent just one of these disasters from happening, if we can prevent just one family from going through what the families at Imperial Sugar are going through, it'd be worth it. Meanwhile, something's happened that sheds a whole new light on the debate and gives us a whole new reason for adopting a national standard and doing so as quickly as we can. Because Georgia isn't waiting for Congress to act. The Georgia Insurance Commissioner, John Oxendine, has exercised his authority under Georgia law to adopt the voluntary standards promulgated by the people who know best how to prevent these disasters from happening, the NFPA, and to make those standards mandatory. But in Georgia. Now, I commend him for his prompt action, but I want to emphasize that this action gives us a new and compelling reason for national action, because it's no longer an issue about losing jobs to foreign markets where they don't care about worker safety as much as we do. We now have to worry about Americans losing jobs to other Americans just because they happen to live in states where they haven't learned the lessons of Imperial Sugar yet. Unsafe competition is unfair competition, and the specter of unsafe competition from abroad is bad enough, but the reality of unsafe competition right here at home is even worse. If we really want to do what we can to prevent this from happening, we need to act, and we need to act now. The bill that Chairman Miller and I have introduced essentially does two major things. First, it directs OSHA to issue a rule within 90 days, which would, as a general matter, require manufacturers to comply with the NFPA standards that right now are purely voluntary. Basic safety would no longer be an employer option, and it would no longer be a local option. It would be a common obligation and a common right. Second, our bill would give OSHA the opportunity to modify or revise the rule before it becomes final if they think they can make it better. But it shifts to OSHA the burden of showing how those standards can be made better, and we don't leave workers at risk for as long as that can take. I commend the members of this committee, especially Chairman Miller and Congresswoman Woolsey, for trying to do something about this for a long time. The time to act is now. We owe it to the victims of last month's tragedy and to all the other victims before that to do what we can to prevent this sort of thing from ever happening again. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you, and thank you very much for taking your time and coming to testify, but also the time that you've spent with the victims, the workers, and the managers of this facility. You mentioned one of the common arguments, and that is that somehow these, if we impose these regulations, that will drive the jobs overseas. That's commonly used by people who don't want the regulation. But I just wondered what you see, what kind of reaction you're getting from your constituents.
Again, Mr. Chairman, the idea of unsafe competition being something we have to compete with on a national level is bad enough. But while other states are moving forward on a state-by-state basis to try and address this problem, the reality is we got unsafe competition right here at home. And I think the specter of unsafe competition abroad is exaggerated, but we shouldn't tolerate that either. We should insist, as a condition of fair trade agreements and the like, that folks incorporate the cost of doing things safely in our competing markets, just like we incorporate the cost of doing things safely as a cost of doing business in our country. As I said, unsafe competition is unfair competition. That's true at the national level, and it's also going to be true if we don't act at the national level. It's going to be true right here at home.
What, when you know, under the tragic circumstances in which you discuss this with your constituents, do you get any sense that there was an awareness or a plan to deal with this risk, or there was knowledge of people of what this risk was inside that in that facility or in the community?
The sense that I get, Mr. Chairman, is that folks who work in the plants are generally aware that there is some risk, but what's all too obvious is that the standards that were in force and the standards that were in effect nationwide are not adequate to prevent this sort of thing from happening. And while it's one thing to know about it, it's another to realize just how great the likelihood of an incident is. And the greater the gravity of the harm, the less likelihood you have to have in order to have a need to act. And that's what I think we're dealing with here.
Thank you.
I'd like to welcome my colleague, Jack Kingston, here.
Mr. Kingston, we welcome you. We're trying to fit this testimony in and out of the votes, and I was told there wasn't going to be a second vote, but I see obviously there is a second vote. But thank you for coming over, and we have some minutes here. I don't know if you've made this vote, but yeah. No. Okay.
And I'm sorry that I wasn't here for my colleague's testimony. I just want to say that thank you very much for inviting me, and I appreciate this committee's interest in dust standards, and I think it's good to have this hearing, and I think it's important to act quickly and also act effectively, because the goal that we all share is to prevent accidents like this in the future, and I know we're all united in comprehensive worker safety. I am a little concerned about the bill that in its present form it could have some unintended consequences. Primarily, my concern is that it may be a one-size-fits-all approach. We need to make sure that we have regulations tailored to different types of dust and different types of industries Just to name a few, there's coal, there's metal, there's organics, there's sugar, there's plastic, wood, and pharmaceutical dust, each with its own chemical property, each with its own flashpoints. And I think the bill should be careful to address those differences. Another thing, that the bill does not call for more inspections from OSHA. Now, that might be something that we need to look at from an appropriation standpoint, but there are about 80,000 plants in the country that have potential dust-related hazards, but since this legislation doesn't call for additional inspections, housekeeping and violations of the General Duty Clause of the 1970 Occupational Safety and Health Act could continue to be a problem. And H.R. 5522 recommends a rule based on having no less protection than the National Fire Protection Association standards. The NFPA 654 and NFPA 484 feature numerous provisions which are comparable to existing OSHA standards, such as housekeeping controls for accumulation of combustible dust and electrical ignition sources. Other parts of NFPA 654 and 484 would actually expand the scope of OSHA's authority into areas such as building design, and that may be the intent of the committee, but I think we need to be aware of that. In addition, NFPA 61 is not mentioned in the bill, but that's the portion that covers ag products such as sugar, and certainly we should look at that in terms of this legislation. Also, H.R. 5522 requires that OSHA violate its statutory mandate for a public comment period. I see why Congress wants to move quickly, but doing so could eliminate helpful comments from thousands of industry stakeholders, employees, and unions who could contribute helpful suggestions and concerns. Without the appropriate time frame for evaluation and their input, it will be difficult for OSHA to determine any unintended consequences of this regulation. And finally, we don't definitely know what caused this tragedy. Numerous inspectors are trying to answer that question even as we meet today. These include OSHA, the Chemical Safety Board, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, local fire inspectors, and insurance adjusters. Among these questions are, what ignited the dust? Why, after 90 years of operation, did an explosion of this size occur? Was there a change in dust containment? Was there a lapse in housekeeping? Did the ventilation change? Was there a processing change? Certainly answers to these questions are going to be relevant to effective legislation. While fast action is desired, appropriate action and regulation should not be discounted. I hope we can meet both these objectives, and I look forward to working with you and Mr. Barrow, and I thank Mr. Barrow for introducing this. And with that, Mr. Chairman, that's my testimony.
Thank you very much for your testimony, and we have a couple minutes remaining here. I think what just in your suggestion, Congressman Kingston, that you know there are a lot of different types of industries where dust is created in the process. I think one of the encouraging things is the Chemical Safety Board looked across these industries. Many of them are very different in both product and processing, but what they saw was you didn't have a consistent system with integrity of removing the fuel from this. Ignition points come in all different fashions, but it's the presence of the fuel, and when they looked at this, they didn't see a framework to make sure that fuel was minimized during this process. There were a lot of different procedures that people could follow, and a lot of different places they could go to get information, but nothing that really required a comprehensive framework for the removal of that dust, and that's the challenge. And that's what this hearing is about. Is that conflict, Mr. Congressman Barrow?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to add some emphasis to some of the things that Jack said, and I agree with the idea that we have to have appropriate input from the appropriate stakeholders, but I'd point out that the NFPA standards have evolved as the result of give and take and input from every conceivable sector of the industrial economy in this country for over 60 years now. What's needed is not input, because we've got that. What's needed is the will to act. When you got an agency that don't know its job or don't care about its job, or has got all kinds of reasons for not doing its job, it's a little bit like going bird hunting and having to tote the dog. What we need is the will to act, and if the agency won't do it, we need to get going ourselves and put the standards on the books that'll protect people for as long as it takes them to do their job.
Well, you know, when you and I talked about possible legislation or how we would respond, you know, there was concern that we would start drafting regulations here in this committee and then impose them. And of course, what we found out was here's a series of regulations that are in force and effect in many areas in the state, in the country, and they have evolved. They had sort of a continuous process of inputs about how to evolve these regulations. So, you know,
they've evolved in the private sector.
Starting point
Exactly.
for OSHA, not the final point.
They've evolved in the private sector, and they're working in the private sector where they're being implemented.
Anything else?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
We're going to go. You have questions?
No questions.
No questions. Okay. We're going to recess, I guess, for a moment here. This is a very well orchestrated process we have going here between the floor and the committee. Hopefully, we'll get done with this series of votes as soon as possible. We'll return and we will begin with our next panel. Again, Congressman Barrow, Congressman Kingston, thank you for your time and for your testimony. The committee will return as soon as possible.